Hi, so I'm here with Brian Hughes, a psychologist at the University of Galway, formerly a University of Ireland at Galway, I guess, or in Galway. And we're here to talk about Brian's new book, Psychology's Quiet Conservatism. And so, Brian, thanks. So why don't you tell us sort of overall first what the thrust of the book is, or what the thrust of the argument you're making here is?
Sure. Well, it's kind of a momentous or memorable day because I got my first copy of the
Oh,
book in the
congratulations.
so it does exist.
Right, I have a PDF copy. I have an online copy.
Yeah. The digital format seems to have been released worldwide. So the book essentially it's called Psychology's Quiet Conservatism, and it addresses how psychology fits into the culture wars context and the culture war conversation, because psychology is often seen as a liberal discipline and accused of being a woke discipline. And my case is that despite that sense that psychology is woke or liberal, that the field's methods, theories, and practices combine to promote a worldview that is fundamentally a socially conservative one. Psychology does it downplays inequalities, it pathologizes dissent, it resists social change, it reinforces what's already there.
Is that
And
inherently a part of psychology? Or oh, go ahead.
yeah, I think it is. Well, psychology promotes a personalized view of the human experience and what I call an individuocentric view. And that has the effect of deleting the social and political and economic context for everything. So, in essence, psychology is a study of individuals in the world and it promotes individual solutions to individual problems, where most problems that people encounter in the world are actually systemic and they require social solutions and structural solutions. So, psychology promotes the personal libertarian kind of view of individual sovereignty, and that means that all we have to do then is blame the victims rather than the system when things go wrong.
So that sort of self-acknowledge, self-actualization, or sort of all those things that one heard about in the 60s and 70s, or so on and so
Sure.
forth.
Yeah, I mean, the self-actualization thing comes from what we call humanistic psychology, and that is, Maslow and all of those theorists. It's often seen as a kind of progressive part of psychology, but it's deeply individualistic. It tries to solve the world's problems one self-actualization at a time. And it encourages people to find benefit in their predicaments. So that's okay if you're a kind of a privileged person with mild anxiety and you can sort of look upon your life differently in order to get through that. But if you're a person at the margins of society facing discrimination, facing violence, or if your rights are being undermined, then looking on the bright side of that, seeking benefit from that, is a very kind of a shallow response, and it's not very comforting, and it certainly won't change the world. And by encouraging people to look inside themselves for change, you're basically guaranteeing that the world will carry on the way it is, which of course is deeply unjust and unequal. So in that sense, psychology actually propels the narrative to the right because it makes people, as I say, focus on themselves rather than focus on protest or focus on system change or focus on overthrowing inequalities.
Well, but that I think you probably at this point that individualized view also grew out of sort of the economic changes, industrial revolution, and sort of the sort of basically world changes that you know uh, altered how we view family and how we view individuals within communities as well.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I mean, I think individualists existed before industrialization, but yes, the Industrial Revolution precipitated a radical change in how we live our lives and how we value people. And before the Industrial Revolution, people lived alongside each other in society. People with disabilities, for example, people with intellectual disabilities, and people with cognitive, I suppose, limitations of different kinds. But with the arrival of industrialization and the whole structure associated with day-to-day life, you needed to be numerate, you needed to be organized, you needed to be productive in that, economic sense. And that was the period when people began to be identified as not fit for modernity, not fit for modern society, not productive. And this is what some theorists call capitalist realism, the idea that the only way to look upon humanity is as a set of people who will or will not be economically productive. And if you're not economically productive, that equates to disability. That's an entirely arbitrary frame, but that's very much what psychology, espouses. It identifies disability in terms of a person's ability to participate in the norms of society without ever questioning those norms.
Right, so it's a sort of hierarchical view of that also incorporates morality and sort of moral norms as well, that working is always better for everybody and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. So you have even parties of the left, not the radical left, to use that term that, the United States has invented recently, but of the traditional political left, parties would present themselves as standing up for working people
Hmm.
and therefore not being capitalistic. But inadvertently, standing up for working people identifies that people who are economically productive are important, but people who are disabled or ill or who choose philosophically not to participate in a rat race, that they are less important. Because the non-working people are not necessarily flawed people.
Right.
So I think a lot of our contemporary political discourse is actually right of center to right and to far right. That even the so-called left-wing positions are often very, very far from what used to be seen in the left-wing part of things.
So how does this translate? Let's bring this then down to the level, or not down to the level, or sort of just the specifics of how does this reflect in the worlds of ME or ME/CFS, long COVID, sort of the general category of disorders that are obviously people are disabled from,
Yeah.
but with no credibility in the biomedical domain, given lack of or minimal so far, given lack of biomarkers or inability so far to pinpoint biomarkers and sort of all the other things that we sort of know are complicated with these diseases to try to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, at a macro level, the arguments around disability and chronic illness are often intertwined with these issues because what we're referring to here is this psychogenic hypothesis, the idea that if a person cannot be established to be physically ill through some kind of, biomarker, that it must be psychological. And psychology has inserted itself into those conversations repeatedly over many, many decades. Um, and that becomes a political question insofar as the appetite for that idea is heightened among people who are concerned about spending money on disability. So rather than providing social safety nets, illness benefits, medical services to people who have, suffering in their lives, psychology participates in this bureaucratic effort to try to distance itself from those commitments, to try to avoid those commitments. And it has to be said that many psychologists and their psychiatrist cousins have been at the forefront of that effort to characterize unexplained illnesses as psychiatric problems. And the audience for that are the people who want to cut costs in healthcare because, characterizing somebody as psychologically unwell, it reduces the bill. It's a lot cheaper to deal with than trying to characterize people as medically unwell in the traditional sense, which requires not only medical services, but also all sorts of illness benefits and concessions and permissions in society.
Well, I think that we've also seen that it's not just that this is useful to those in making decisions, whether insurers or government agencies, but there's actually usually, or not usually, I should say, there are tend to be or can be close links between the professional group doing the studies and doing the research and those making the decisions in terms of advising or consulting links, or they're on boards and so on, actually making the decisions as the experts in the field. So there's kind of a symbiotic relationship there between those priorities.
Yes, and the individuocentric view of psychology is very attractive, because it focuses not on the systems you're talking about, the embeddedness of the economy with finance, with governance, and with healthcare delivery, those entanglements between pharmaceuticals and insurance and vested interests, you might say. It focuses only on individuals. So we can talk about people's disabilities in terms of the deficits in their repertoire of behaviors. That an individual who has an illness is to some extent responsible for themselves, and the wider society isn't responsible for fixing their problems or improving their lives. Um, Disciplines like sociology and anthropology, they also study how human beings live and experience the world. But they have less prestige than psychology, and they have less funding than psychology.
Mhm.
Not because of what they do, but because of, psychology is prioritized not because of what it's good at, but what it's bad at. Psychology is bad at studying privilege and unpicking the political, root causes for people's lives and life problems. Whereas anthropology and sociology is quite focused on things like power and prestige and privilege. So psychology is usually seen as an attractive proposition by decision makers and bureaucrats, because it restricts itself to studying anything except power and privilege in social systems.
Well, also because one, providing, just in practical terms, providing 3 months of of cognitive behavior therapy or some kind of, physical therapy is a lot less expensive than however many years of long-term disability, or, medical care, which people may actually require to deal with the problems.
Yeah, and it becomes self-reinforcing because once psychological services are developed to such an extent that they're available all through the system for this
Mhm.
purpose, it becomes very hard to remove that or to change that. And
Mhm.
that was certainly the experience in the UK in relation to the NICE guideline updates for ME, which I'm sure many of your, if not all of your viewers will be very familiar with,
Right.
where the effort to change that system and to remove psychological services as a frontline treatment was resisted by the professional associations who went into meetings with NICE not to question the science behind the debate, but to raise their concerns about the provision of services. What are you going to do with all of these psychologists who are delivering cognitive behavior therapy to tens of thousands of people with ME? If cognitive behavior therapy is no longer recommended, in fact, if it's discouraged, then there's a practical resistance to that by people who work as psychologists and work in psychology. And that's to some extent human nature, I suppose.
Well, I mean, there's a whole bureaucratic structure that's been and structure of service that's been built up with expertise, with, a whole kind of infrastructure around the provision of these services. And once you then say, oops, sorry, those services really are not what's required, it sort of requires not just a turn of the switch, but everybody below that sort of learned under that hierarchical framework, they have to unlearn everything if they're going to continue in the field or just insist that they're doing the right thing.
And that is the very essence of conservatism in a sense, is don't change the system, don't rock the system, don't overthrow the system. Things are the way they are because that's the right way for things to be. And the conservative instinct is, it must be right because that is how it has always been. So it is conservatism in lots of ways that is characterizing the whole situation. Not just this broader political type of conservatism, but just ordinary bureaucratic conservatism and inertia. It's human nature not to change the system because the decision makers or the people who have benefited from the status quo.
So, what do you suggest in the domain we're talking about, sort of ME, long COVID, similar related diseases? What given the psychological framework and psychological imperatives you've laid out, what are sort of some answers to getting around that or to making change?
Well, I think it's a difficult question. I think the particulars in relation to ME services are probably moving in the right direction through the systems and processes that are currently there. But these are systems outside of the psychology
Mhm.
bubble, and these
Mhm.
are science-led regulatory bodies like NICE, who are transparently and publicly going through the process of analyzing research in order to develop practices. Now, not everybody likes the end product, but I think having those systems of decision making in public and explicitly evidence-based, and having it open and taking as long as it takes, so to speak, that's a good thing. That's a way of doing this. It is sort of bringing it out into the open. I do think, from my perspective, from psychology, the parts that psychologists can play is to be a bit more humble about the capacity for psychology to solve the world's problems. And I
Mhm.
think we need to be more self-aware in psychology as to the limitations of what we do and to our place in the bigger system. We don't have all the answers. We're not the God of the gaps who can, magically, explain everything that has heretofore been considered a mystery. Um, we should be able to understand that lots of things in life, including illnesses and symptoms, have many causes, and psychological factors can only be influential in certain ways and in small parts of that.
Mhm.
I think we need to have a self-evaluation in psychology and rethink how we sell ourselves as a solution.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate it. That was a interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks for having me.